Hi guys, before the video starts, please check out my Movember campaign, all the details for which can be found in the description. The nation of Denmark has won 4 majors between only 6 players. Other nations have more major winners in their ranks, notably Sweden having 12, yet it is Denmark who has the most skilled and deepest player pool of any nation ever in Counter-Strike. In the top 20 teams in CSGO as of recording, according to HLTV, there are 16 Danish players, and that only includes the starting 5s. That number goes up when you include players on the benches of teams and players on teams that are currently making their way back into contention, such as Mad Lions. It has not always been like this. For many years, the best that Danish CS had to offer was that core of the current Astralis roster, who played for a variety of different organisations as they struggled to compete with the elite French and Swedish teams of early CSGO. They never quite were able to find that success, always choking or being just not close enough. Eventually, in 2016, with the rise of Brazilian CS, the great nations of CSGO realised they had a problem. They had no youth players to come in and replace some of their more aging members, and they had no in-game leaders to come in and start new teams to compete with those top teams, because no one had been nurturing that youth and developing them and forming them into the pros they needed to be to compete at the highest level in Counter-Strike. Some of the more notable examples of this are Fnatic, when they went through about 15 different players in the space of a year, and Virtus.pro, who no matter how many players they trialed, could never seem to find one that fit in at the highest level. To use an analogy that's more pertinent to everyday life, imagine if instead of a company promoting from within to make sure that the people that are getting into the management positions have some sort of knowledge of how the company works at all levels, they were only bringing in outside hires who had never seen how the company works and never seen how the system's supposed to run. This is what was happening in the French, Swedish, Polish scenes, where people were just being brought in because their CV looks good, essentially, and they reached the top level and didn't know what the hell was going on. They didn't understand the meta, they didn't understand how the players were buying, how the players were rotating, and what sort of roles were being played, because they had never been introduced to that system early enough. Eventually, these French, Swedish, Polish teams were being overtaken by everyone from international teams to even North American teams, which is saying something considering where we started from in CSGO. Eventually, in 2018, 2019, Astralis became the most dominant force in CSGO, but there were so many other Danish players and teams competing at the highest level and winning tournaments. So how did the Danes manage this? The problem that the other great Counter-Strike nations have is one of egos. The established top players, especially in France and Poland, refused to accept that they might not be the best players in the world anymore, and that their way of playing the game was getting outdated. The few players who tried to bring in positive change, such as Existence, were deemed not skilled enough and sent to play with weaker teams that lacked proper funding and support. It was a combination of two things, really, that meant the Danish scene never fell apart like this, and instead they continued to thrive and put out quality roster after quality roster. Firstly, there was a decent number of IGLs that came into CSGO or transitioned to that role early in the game's lifetime. This meant they never suffered from a shortage of IGLs, as we notably saw with the French and Polish scenes. Secondly, their best players were all relatively young and didn't really hit their stride at the beginning of CSGO. This allowed them to be moulded by the IGLs of the time and develop the right mentality for the game. Contrast this to France, where the players were already huge successes from their Counter-Strike source days, and because they had so much success at the beginning of CSGO, they became immediately very stubborn and resistant to change. Once a Danish player had gone through the process of making a name for themselves, showing off their aim, showing off their individual abilities, they were typically scouted and entered into a team, oftentimes run by Hunden. Hunden never had the biggest name org behind him, so he couldn't sign the biggest free agents, but he had a special skill for finding young, skilled players and moulding them into the professionals afterwards. Some of the best players in the Danish scene were scouted out by or formed by Hunden, including Esatag, Nico, and most notably Glaive, who went on to be a part of the greatest team in CSGO so far. The next step in this Danish system was to move on to one of the rosters being led by MSL, Fetish for a time early on, or later Snappy. These IGLs were competing at a higher level than Hunden, allowing these players to test themselves against the elite competition in the world. This progression from pugs to pro is the reason why the Danish talent pool is so deep and diverse, as no player can make it to the highest level without first being introduced to that structured playstyle required to compete with the elite in CSGO. So why do I consider these IGLs, Hunden and MSL especially, to be the godfathers of the Danish CS scene? Aside from being older and one of the leaders, what earns them that special title of Godfather? Well, The godfather of the family plays an incredibly important role that extends far beyond simply being older and wiser. The godfathers make sure that the family doesn't fall apart, and it makes sure that those in the family learn to respect the authority figures that come above them. A successful godfather doesn't just care about maximizing their own earnings in the present, but has a focus on making sure all of those who come up through the family have the best chance to accumulate wealth and power for themselves, which therefore benefits the entire family as a whole. All of the pros at the top of the Danish scene have to thank men like Hund and Fetish and MSL to one degree or another for their success. A lot of them have either been formed by them, were scouted out by them, or play alongside players formed by them. That's the biggest thing that you'd noticed in the scenes that failed, is that all the players at the top looked around and found no one to help them, no one who could play at the highest level, and no one who had even the vaguest notion of how to play at the highest level. The fact that these players were all formed as they came through the ranks is what allowed them to have such a deep player pool. They have to pay homage to the Godfathers and follow the example they have set once their time in the spotlight comes to an end. I hope that in 10 years' time it will be Glaive and Blaymeth playing for lesser known orgs and forming the future of their scene, and that more players from other scenes will follow their example. Okay, well, relatively quick one today, but if you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and remember to check out my Movember campaign down below. We've just had to update the goals because we reached our first target, so that's great news. Yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.